Welcome to this video on UK politics based on the idea of the franchise. The franchise is who can vote. And obviously this has a huge fundamental impact on all political systems. And the voter base will change the kind of political system you have and the kind of decisions that the politicians in charge will make. And we're going to look at the development of the franchise over time, and we're going to look at some of the current debates about the franchise and different groups it could potentially be extended to. Right, so let's start with the situation today. So essentially, if you are over 18, you are a UK resident or UK citizen, rather than resident, I should say. So you're a UK citizen or a Commonwealth citizen who is resident in the UK, or you are a UK citizen who is living abroad and have registered to vote in the last 15 years, you can vote unless you are in prison, a member of the House of Lords, or being found guilty of some kind of election-related crime. Now, there are residents of the UK who cannot vote. So if you are an EU citizen living in the UK, then that doesn't give you the right to vote. If you're a US citizen living in the UK, that doesn't give you the right to vote. But generally speaking, the vast majority of over 18-year-olds who are UK citizens and UK residents or UK citizens living abroad can vote. Now, not everybody does, and this is one of the slightly odd things when you look at this in terms of the whole history of it. People have struggled and strived and fought and died to get the vote, but lots of people today have the right and choose not to for various reasons. Now, this might be because there are none of the political parties they feel represent their views. It might be that they feel that them voting has no impact. It might be that they don't feel in a position to vote because they don't feel that they know enough about it. It might be that they're too busy, that there's too much else going on, and therefore it comes to polling day and they don't get out and vote. So the franchise is quite broad and big in the UK now, but not everybody uses it. So the growth of the franchise. So if we go back to pre-1832, if we go back to the beginning of the 19th century, then essentially almost nobody could vote. It was a small group of wealthy men could vote. Some of them actually could vote multiple times, because it depends. You could vote in the area that you live, but also in any area where you owned a business, and in any in the area where you went to university, if you went to university. So essentially, it is the land-owning class that could vote, and the ability to vote depended on you owning a certain amount of land. The constituencies across the UK varied enormously at this time. There were county seats and borough seats, and a lot of these boroughs were what was known as rotten boroughs. And this would mean that they had very few voters, as few as one. Voting also was done publicly, so everybody knew how you voted. So if there was a really powerful landowner in the area and you got the vote, then you would be voting in front of them, so they would know how you voted. So they might then be displeased if you didn't vote for, I don't know, their son. So it was not a great system at all. And really, if we look back at it, then Britain would have called itself a democracy at the beginning of the 19th century. Was it really? Well, that's highly debatable. And actually, quite a lot of the constituency elections were not contested at all, which has meant there was one candidate and they won. And essentially, they would just be nominated, often known as a nomination borough, by a local member of the aristocracy. From 1832, things started to change, and this is where we start to see all the struggle and the campaigning and various other bits that have fed into people getting a vote. So, 1832, before this, only upper-class males could vote. This changes. So anybody who owned property of a certain value, didn't have to be land, could be property, were given the vote, and this enfranchised about 300,000 men. So this now meant 20% of the adult male population could vote, which was under 6% of the population as a whole. Now, there had been big campaigns before this. There was even some violence, but the the movement didn't stop there. There's a really important movement in the middle of the 19th century known as the Chartist Movement. They wanted the franchise extending to all men over 21. That doesn't happen in the time of the Chartists, but it does happen in 1918. They wanted payment of MPs. Seems like a straightforward idea, but before this actually came in, it doesn't come in under the Chartist time, it doesn't come in until 1912. Then the only people who can be members of parliament are people who have independent wealth. So they actually will be able to survive and live well without actually having to go to work. So working men can't become MPs at this point. They wanted the secret ballot. Now that will come in again after the Chartist movement has finished in 1872. They wanted to scrap the property qualification for MPs. Again, this comes in much later. They wanted equal constituency sizes. Doesn't come in under the time of Charters, but does come in 1884. And they wanted annual parliamentary elections, which hasn't happened, though it does sometimes feel like it in recent times when we had, for example, elections in 2015, 2017, and 2019, but never quite getting to the extent of every year. And the reason behind why they wanted it was because they believed what it would do is it would hold members of parliament to account better if they had to stand for election every year. It would have been an enormously time-consuming thing to do. Right, the second Great Reform Act, the Great Reform Act of 1867, actually started to extend the vote to skilled workers, not so much just the kind of the top end of the middle class, and also went to people called compounders, who paid their rates as part of their rent. So if you paid the rates at all in any form, then you would qualify to vote. It removed some of the rotten boroughs, but not all of them, and gave MPs to some of the industrial towns and cities that hadn't really had it before. The industrial north and the Midlands was still massively underrepresented, but it did get better. And in this one, 700,000 men came to vote. So we're slowly getting there. We've added essentially 1 million men to the franchise in the first two Great Reform Acts in the 19th century. 1872, the Secret Ballot Act comes in, and voting is now done in secret. This removes a lot of the corruption and the kind of the bullying and the bribery and all that kind of stuff around elections. There's also limits on the amount you can spend on your election campaign and how many voters you can transport to voting stations or polling stations. So that starts to move us towards something that looks a bit more like the democracy we would now recognise, where you could actually vote in secret and people wouldn't know how you'd voted. And because it's in secret, well, bribery can still happen, but it's a bit of a mug's game, bribing people in a secret ballot. Did you vote for me? Yes, you did. Here's your tenner. Thank you. Just go see somebody else. Did you vote for me? Yes, I did. Thank you. Well done. Here's your tenner. As you can see, it just doesn't work as well. Now, a lot of people at the time felt this was un-English, that you should be able to stand proud and say, I voted for this person, this is why I did it. But that was kind of ignoring the reality of bribery and corruption, kind of like, I spend lots of money in your shop, you will vote for me, otherwise I will stop doing it. You will vote for me, or this group of men I've employed will give you a good kicking. So that kind of stuff ends to a degree. 1884, this is the real big one. 2.5 million male voters added with this one, and this for the first time gives the vote to some members of the working class. But we're still in a situation where MPs aren't paid. There's a property qualification for becoming an MP, so we don't immediately get a huge number of working class MPs. We do start getting the movements towards the Labour Party following this, because some working class men now have the vote. The franchise still remained biased towards the heads of household, so a lot of younger men didn't get the vote. There was a really complicated registration system, and this kind of discounted a lot of male working class votes as well. As part of an agreement for the 1884 Reform Act, the Conservatives then drew up in 1885 a Redistribution Act. And this redrew the boundaries of constituencies, and they were now roughly all the same size. And this is the basis of the system which we have now. Now, the Conservatives were very, very clever, and when they created the new constituencies, they did it based on the pursuits of the people. And what they essentially did when they drew the boundaries is they would draw working class boundaries, And so you'd have the workers in one, all piled up in one constituency, and then they have another one where they draw a middle class constituency that would have the factory owners and the shop owners and the managers and the white collar workers in it. And they would kind of go, and so yes, well, these people got different interests, so they needed different representatives. This became known as Villa Toryism, and what it did is it meant that in cities that would have voted first of all Liberal and then later on Labour, there was remaining kind of a Conservative seat. A really good example of this is Sheffield Hallam, which is a great example of Villa Toryism, where they created a constituency which remained Conservative for a very, very long time following 1885. Right. So women getting the vote is a major part of our next step. So we've got suffragists such as the National Union for Women's Suffrage Societies. They've been campaigning very peacefully for a large number of years, and they made some progress and they were winning some people over, but they weren't getting the vote. And then we see the emergence of the suffragettes from 1903 under the Pankhursts, and they start taking direct action. So we see firebombing of letterboxes, we see confrontations with the police, we see women being dragged out, we see Emily Davison grabbing the reins of the King's Horse and sadly being killed. So we see kind of a real struggle here. We see terrible police brutality with the Cat and Mouse Act and the force feeding of suffragettes who went on hunger strike in prison, as they were political prisoners, not criminals. And this gets a huge amount of publicity and movement towards the female suffrage. We then get World War I. The role that women play in World War I then plays a massive role in also ensuring that women get the vote. And they did get the vote in 1918. But in a move that does seem utterly bizarre to us in the modern day, women got the vote age 30, whilst all men at this point get the vote age 21. Now you can see why you'd get male universal suffrage following World War I. The working class men who wouldn't have had the vote have been fighting and dying in the trenches, and they get the vote. And the women have been doing this incredible work on the home front, and therefore taking on roles they've never done before. And so you can see where they get the vote. The thought at the time was that women matured more slowly than men, which is why you've got the differential in voting age, which is just nonsense. But that's what they believed at the time. 10 years later, however, it was equalised in 1928 and voting age becomes 21 for everybody. Now, 21 seems quite old, doesn't it? Well, it wasn't actually until 1969 that finally it was removed down to 18. This largely came out of social change rather than any necessarily big campaign. So leading up to 32 and 67, 84, and then and 1918, we see huge amounts of protest movements, violence on the streets, things like that. We don't really see that with the movement to 18 in 69. There was just more of a kind of realization that the 18-year-olds in 69 were very different to 18-year-olds from previous generations, and also there was a reality of the things that they could do. They could marry without their parents' consent. They could own and rent property. They could make a will. They could have children. So it kind of seemed to make sense to give them the vote as well. And there was talk about 18-year-olds being different because of improved education, improved health, improved diet, mass media, meaning 18-year-olds were now very different to how they'd been in the past. Now, could we use similar arguments now to take the franchise even further? Well, there is a debate about whether 16 and 17-year-olds should get the vote. Now, if you think at 16, there is plenty of stuff that you can do that would suggest that you are old enough to make major decisions. So you can have a baby, you can pay tax, you can join the army, you can give consent to your own medical treatment, you can join a trade union. With your parents' consent, you can get married. So if you're mature enough to do all those things, surely people are mature enough to vote. The counter that people say to that is, well, actually, 16 and 17-year-olds are possibly now actually slightly younger than in previous generations. They still have to be in educational training up until 18. They can only marry with their parents' permission, and the vast majority of 16 and 17-year-olds are completely reliant economically and in other ways on their parents and guardians. again, would then come back to another argument for 16 and 17-year-olds. If we give them the vote, that would empower them, meaning they we encourage them to play a more active role in society, to think about the things going on with them, and they should be making decisions about things that impact on their future. So there's a big argument about this with the recent Brexit referendums, and whether 16 and 17-year-olds should be allowed to vote on that. Now, again, people come back and counter and go, actually, if we look at voter turnout, it is at its lowest amongst young voters, 18 to 24-year-olds. There is little evidence that it would be any better in 16 and 17-year-olds, and there's actually not an enormous amount of evidence that 16 and 17-year-olds particularly want the vote. Now, we do have some real examples in the UK of it actually working. So 16 and 17-year-olds have been given the vote in Scottish elections, for example, the independence referendum, and this has increased political engagement amongst this group. Now, we've seen that in Scotland. The argument on the other side is saying, well, actually, if you talk to most 16 and 17-year-olds, they know very little about politics, and there is the risk that they might either not use their vote, so why bother, or they might misuse it. So they might vote for silly parties or extreme parties. And actually, what we need before we take this move is we need better political education in schools. And it isn't there at the moment, is the argument. And the counter to this goes, well, look, if we look at all the stuff that's online, all the social media, there is an increased political awareness. Young people are becoming more political. Look at the recent movements such as students striking over environmental issues. And there has been a lot of engagement for young people about recent political issues. Again, the counter comes back and goes, well, young people are more likely to be taken in by fake news, by extreme political messages. So there's a really interesting debate there. Have a look at it. Think about what I've said. Read those two sides of the argument. Come up with your own decision on that. Right, another one, and this is a really controversial one, where some people have been pushing, particularly from the liberal side of the political spectrum, is that we should actually give the right to vote to prisoners. They're one of the groups I mentioned right at the beginning of the video who are excluding from it. Now, people who vote that we say that we should give the right to vote to prisoners say it is a fundamental right, should not be removed. The European Court of Human Rights has said so. Prisoners not being allowed to vote is a violation of their human rights. They also say that it is not a deterrent to crime. So people don't go, oh, right, I won't burgle that house because I might temporarily lose the right to vote and there's an election coming up. They say, well, that is not part of people's thought process on crime. There's no evidence that crime rates would go up if you didn't take the right to vote off people. And then the other bit goes, this kind of, with prisoners, you want to rehabilitate them, bring them in as part of society, and show them, talk to them about civic responsibility and not behaving in the way that they have. And actually removing their vote kind of alienates them from society and says that they are different and they are not as valued as other members of society. Now, there's a very angry response to this normally. It starts off by saying essentially prisoners have forfeited their right to vote by committing crimes. The law is very clear. If you are a prisoner, you don't get the vote. You committed a crime against society, therefore there are consequences. And then they come in and say, well, look, having criminals having a say on, for example, how our criminal justice system works and the number of police on the street doesn't seem like a really sensible idea. So that fundamentally doesn't make any sense. And also, you've got to then think in more practical terms as well. So it's one of the counter arguments of prisoner votes is go, well, prisons obviously sit within certain constituencies. So you suddenly have a constituency that had a large prisoner vote, people who could be brought in from all over the country aren't going to stay there long term once they're out of prison. But you'd end up with prison constituencies that might end up with very different results to the ones that the rest of the population who naturally live in that area would like. So again, it's a difficult one. It's one that tends to get people quite agitated. Have a think, decide. Which way would you go on that one? Right. Thank you very much for listening and watching. Hope you found that interesting, got a bit more insight in the development of the franchise in the UK and some of the key debates going forward about 16 and 17-year-olds and prisoners. So it's a really interesting topic, the franchise. And when we look into this in a more detail, we'll look at things like voting behaviour and why people vote the way that they do, and we'll look at electoral systems and how that impacts on the way people vote. The fundamental on it is who can vote and why that matters. Right, thank you very much for watching.